it's my pleasure to give a little bio for our next speaker, Joy. Joy is originally from the United States, but has spent the last 15 years in Latin America. She's the founder of Vida Plena, a mental health organization that equips local community leaders in proven evidence-based mental health care treatment for depression. This method has been endorsed by the World Health Organization as their top recommendation for mental health care in low-income settings. Joy, you're welcome.
Everybody. I guess actually before anything, since this is like a Christian group, I just like to take the advantage just a moment and to just pray for a second. And so, God, I just want to thank you for all the people in this room who truly care about these topics and are really thinking thoughtfully about how to help the people around us. I just pray that you give us wisdom to do this work well, and just help for this talk and the rest of this space to really continue to bring you glory in all that we do. So, amen. Yeah. I just really, thanks for letting me indulge in that. It's not often in these kind of spaces that we can actually have this kind of element, bring in this actual piece of our faith. And so I really feel quite privileged to be here because as an implementer, I don't have a background in research specifically or M&E. And so it's just been really wonderful to be able to learn from so many of you, from really your experience doing this at a very thoughtful level. And so, what I would like to do is just kind of share a little bit about my thoughts, specifically working in mental health and experience, what we're doing. So, but just kind of start us off. So maybe lots of you, I wonder how many people in this room went on some sort of missions trip, volunteer student experience, probably a number of people. And so I had a similar experience when I was my freshman year of university of college. And a few years back, I found my journal because it was actually supposedly a Spanish language intensive course. So we had to keep it to get a journal about our experiences. And to my chagrin, I found the bubbly writing of an 18-year-old girl, this pretty nauseating cliche in which said, "It's amazing. Everybody is so poor but happy." And that is the very superficial experience that so many people have when they spend their first time abroad in a developing world context. And if I could go back and gently explain to that enthusiastic but very naive former self that it was my inability to speak Spanish that resulted in a certain level of superficiality in all of my interactions. While I was admiring the simple and very generous way in which people received me as kind of this outsider and this random white girl who shows up in their village, they were very kind and welcoming. What I was confused by that was I thought that friendliness and generosity, I saw that, but what I missed was this deeper world of sadness and tragedies and hardship that also exists. So today, what I'm here to talk to you about is a really important topic that affects millions. Specifically mental health. And as Christians, we are called to love our neighbors as ourselves and to help the vulnerable in our communities. And this means not just meeting their physical needs, but also, who we've been talking about in the last couple of days, their spiritual needs and their emotional needs. We are holistic people. We sometimes try to parse these pieces out, but it really is all connected. And then also specifically within our space in international development, there is growing awareness, but it is still far too often ignored, how to include mental health as a piece of that. So today for my talk, I'm going to talk about sort of a few key pieces. First, I'm going to talk about why Christians cannot ignore mental health and offer up sort of a Christian perspective on what mental health could look like. Very briefly, I'm not a divinity student, but sort of some initial thoughts. Secondly, why the international development community can't afford actually to ignore mental health and think about some of the ways that's being integrated very creatively so we can learn from those experiences. And then somewhat humbly offer up my organization that I've created as an example of what mental health care can look like. I offer it up because I did not create the model, so therefore I'm just replicating, building off of the great experience of a lot of other practitioners who've really already developed this, and we're replicating this in a new place. So then we'll try to have maybe a little bit of discussion about how you can apply that in your own work. But really, the main idea I'd like to leave you with is the idea that us as Christians and as international development practitioners, we have a moral imperative to be thinking about the holistic well-being of the people we're working for. What does that emotional, psychological, mental health piece look like? And then really just think about that in our work. And so, like, how do we prioritize that in a number of different settings? Because evidence-based programs do exist. And so we can learn from them and be able to apply them. So let's talk a little bit first about the scale of mental health. Worldwide, common mental health disorders such as depression and anxiety, they affect about 1 in 5 adults. That's about 20%. So it's about this much of the room. It'd be a way to kind of think about it. And then if you look at severe mental health disorders such as schizophrenia, that's about 7% of the adult population. So kind of like sometimes it's helpful to have that at scale and sort of like a comparison. And if we look at the global burden of disease, just as like malaria, which is a very common sort of thing we like to look at, that affected it back when they did it in 2013, about 146 million people. But in contrast, about 250 million people are affected by depression. 350 million affected by depression and 250 million by anxiety. And so it is the number of people being affected by that, and that is for quality of life. We also just even want to look at, we were based off of Sam's talk, looking at how many people actually die from these diseases. I was looking, malaria kills about 620,000 people a year, according to 2020 statistics, World Health, and about 700,000 people a year die from suicide. And so just thinking about sort of the magnitudes of what we're dealing with. However, in addition to that, though, because mental health disorders begin very early in life and they tend to be chronic, they represent the leading cause of disability. So 1/3 of years lived with disability are due to mental illness. But what we also kind of want to think about with that is the neglectedness of mental health. In low and middle income countries, less than 1% of public health budgets are dedicated to mental health care. And that's about 6 times less in the developed world. So the result is the majority of people who are suffering from some sort of mental illness are not able to get any of the help that they would need. And just to kind of take a second, I want to kind of dispel sort of these myths that often exist out there. One is that our modern life, sort of the busyness and sort of like all the common pressures that we're experiencing, that's the cause of depression. According to the Pan American Health Organization, official depression statistics at any one moment in Latin America, where we're based, about 5% of the population is living with depression, which is pretty much on par with the US. So there's really not huge disparities there. And then the second sort of myth I often bump against is like, oh, it's just like poverty and that's what causes it. And then if we fixed poverty, there wouldn't be mental illness anymore. Well, we all live here and we know that's also not the case. So there's plenty of mental illness, plenty of people living with depression. And so just like also that part of the myth is also something I'd like to dispel. So now that we've established that mental illness and depression specifically is a specific issue, I want to kind of talk for a minute about how do we think about this as Christians. And so some Christians, sometimes we have like this uncomfortableness around mental illness. Sometimes we have just a difficulty in accepting it within ourselves, and then when we see it with other people, sometimes we don't even think about it as an illness. We want to like completely spiritualize it and say that this is just something we can deal with spiritually. Sometimes, though, what we really need to remember, though, is like Christians get physically sick, and we can therefore become mentally ill. All human beings since the fall, we're living in a broken world with decaying bodies, trapped wills, and disturbed minds. So there's really no more reason to think that a Christian won't experience mental illness any less than they will experience physical illness. Sort of another question we sometimes come against as Christians is it wrong for Christians to get depressed? Isn't the joy of the Lord supposed to be our strength? How do we sing about peace and joy if we're feeling depressed or feeling in those moments? Does it say that there's something wrong with our faith? And I'd propose to you that not at all. If you look at many examples in the Bible, there's examples of people who are suffering deeply. However, too often in churches and the Christian community, we give people sort of like these glib cliches. We tell people to pray more. Even worse, sometimes we tell people that they are sinning. But Jesus was a man of sorrows himself. Paul talks about his constant anxiety for the church. And then we have a book of songs, the Psalms, which are full of laments and people living through their darkest moments. And then if we talk about a little bit more about Jesus' teaching, specifically the Sermon on the Mount, he also talks about being things that he's really concerned with that we would now maybe call mental health. Of course, if you look at an index, you're not going to find the word depression and mental health kind of listed in there, but these topics of people who are deeply suffering, people who are struggling with anxiety, these are themes that we do find. And so sometimes that theme of like there's these teachings that like we shouldn't have any anxieties, to cast all your anxieties, that gets turned into almost like this guilt trip that we put on ourselves and we put on other Christians around us. But I don't think that is actually what the intention was meant to be. Jesus agonized leading up to the cross in Gethsemane. Paul talks about his anxiety, and so neither of them sailed through life with sort of this stoic haze of passionless, apathy. They were people who were feeling very deeply. But the point is that they knew what their true priorities were, and they knew how to bring them before God. And so I would propose that it's not that it's not that we're not allowed to feel these things differently, but then how do we respond, and then how do we reprioritize bringing our concerns before God. And then kind of just as like a final point around this is that as Christians, of course, we are called to bear one another's burdens. And part of those burdens include not just people's physical needs, but also their emotional needs. And so if we can provide to care for emotional support for people, that is part of our ministry and our calling. So then kind of from here, just kind of where we're going with this, my thoughts is kind of next is like, okay, so why should the international development community, as we're thinking about this, also prioritize mental health? It's clear that it's necessary from a Christian perspective, but how does this fit in with the larger frameworks of the work that we're trying to do? And so the reality is that addressing mental health is not just a moral obligation, but it actually there's strategic value in that. By incorporating mental health into our programs, we can create more effective and sustainable solutions that address some of the root causes of both poverty and inequality. So what we're doing now is we'll talk a little bit kind of like what those look like and some of the real world examples. So looking at the kind of connection between mental health and poverty. Well, historically, there's been a lot more focus within global health, looking at communicable and more immediately life-threatening diseases such as HIV and malaria. Mental health has profound effects on all aspects of individuals' quality of life, their physical and social well-being, and their economic productivity. And there's been numbers of studies that have demonstrated this. But pretty specifically, one of the underappreciated effects of depression is the negative impact on people's ability to navigate daily and economic life choices. Specifically, depression impairs memory, information processing, decision-making. It lowers this concept of cognitive flexibility, which is the ability to adapt strategies to changing situations, and executive functioning, so the ability to create steps, to figure out the steps and can follow them. And so this is particularly detrimental for people who are living in poverty, as the direct and indirect costs of poor mental health worsen their economic conditions, setting up this vicious cycle of poverty and mental disorders. Then moreover, mental health issues are associated with the health of other problems, chronic mental health conditions, drug abuse, lower educational achievement, lower life expectancy, and exclusion from professional and social circles. So the effects of poor mental health on society are numerous. Specifically, human capital development can be undermined as people living with mental health problems discontinue education sooner. This then, of course, impacts their potential for future economic growth and prosperity, both at the individual and societal levels. And then additionally, in the workforce, mental health problems lead to lower levels of productivity, There's a lot of absenteeism related to sickness, both for the individuals and for the people who are taking care of them. It's estimated globally that 12 billion productive days are lost every year due to depression. So in addition just to looking at like economic productivity and employment, we also want to look at like what is the effect on the individual and their families and the social context that we live in. I'm sure that a number of you have watched as somebody you care about goes through a mental health illness, and you know that it doesn't just affect that person, but it affects everybody around them. Because really what we are talking about is people who are suffering. People who are, it's this feeling of that constant feeling of like lack of hopelessness, a lack of despair, and that plays out into every aspect of somebody's life. And then there's unfortunately a number of studies that look at the children of parents who have untreated mental illness have poor outcomes. That said, we do have some examples of success. And so we want to look at like how do we incorporate mental health into a number of different programs, and how can that be then used to be able to improve the outcomes, not just for mental health, but for the other pieces that we're looking at, whether that's economic outputs, whether that's physical health, whether that's looking at inequality. There's a lot of different ways that mental health can play into that. So I'm going to look at a couple different quick examples. There's many out there, but the main point is that by addressing mental health within these vulnerable populations, we can achieve better outcomes. So one specific one is looking at HIV treatment adherence. Depression is a very common comorbidity among people who are living with HIV/AIDS, and that can negatively impact their treatment adherence. So there's looking at specifically a randomized controlled trial that was done in Uganda, and it found that integrating depression treatment into HIV led to improved outcomes for antiretroviral therapy, specifically leading to better viral suppression and improved health outcomes. So significantly reducing, and then in addition to significantly reducing depression. So what's interesting about these types of finding is that it indicates that adding a mental health component specifically for people who, again, are suffering from depression or other illnesses, it's not just valuable for perhaps HIV/AIDS, but it can be any sort of like medical condition that requires ongoing follow-up and constant treatment. And another example is looking at agricultural productivity. So a study that was done in 2017 in India demonstrated that treating depression among farmers also led to positive outcomes. Specifically, the study found that farmers who received depression treatment had improved work productivity and income. Also really interesting, they also looked at spending on other healthcare, and those costs were also reduced. So the economic benefits go beyond just like the actual outputs of their farm, but to actual cost savings in other areas of people's lives. And then the last example I want to look at is women's economic empowerment. There was a 2019 study that was looking at a microfinance program that provided small loans to female entrepreneurs. And they combined that with a mental health intervention for depression and anxiety. And it found that women who received not just the loans, but also the mental health intervention had significantly higher economic empowerment scores, in addition to lower depression and anxiety, than those who only received the microfinance program. And so it's really these kind of like combined efforts together, which really can help like magnify the impacts of whatever other program that we're doing. So kind of what I want to do now is these are some of like, bring it back to like a more specific program and a more specific exactly what we're doing. So a little bit about like my story and kind of how we got here. So really what it kind of came down to, I'd been working for about 10 years, been about 15 years now working kind of in community development spaces in Latin America very specifically. And so kind of when you hang around the international development world long enough, it starts to seem that there are constantly new programs that are launching and they have a lot of fanfare, and then they kind of get forgotten. And often poor communities become jaded from NGOs coming in promising all these shiny projects that are untested and and they don't really often have the results that you hope to see, and if they even happen at all. And so when I created Vita Plena, I wanted to do exactly the opposite. Instead of trying to create something new from scratch, what we did was we adapted a model that had been thoroughly proven and vetted. And so for that reason, Vita Plena is based on a treatment that's recommended by the World Health as a first line of treatment for depression in low-income settings. And to be able to do that, this is a partnership I developed with Columbia University out of New York, and they trained our team to ensure that the quality of care and the therapy that we were providing was fully to standard. In essence, I feel like this deep sense of responsibility to the people we're serving, responsibility to provide care that is based on evidence and the best practices. Because far too often, people who are poor have to accept whatever quality of service that is being offered to them. But it feels very important, and I think all of us feel the same, that we don't want to offer false hopes enshrouded with the veneer of good intentions to somebody who is already struggling with the pain of depression. Because regardless of economic circumstances, just as we care for physical health, everyone deserves to have the mental health services that they need. So it is the vision of Vita Plena to be able to provide the mental, emotional, and spiritual tools to ensure that everyone has the opportunity for a full and thriving life. So specifically a little bit kind of going into like what the actual model that we're using. We work with a type of therapy called interpersonal therapy, which along with like CBT is part of the third wave of therapy, basically everything that's not Freudian, and it kind of has like a wider evidence base behind it. And sorry to any Freudians. The couch is over there. It looks very nice. But so really what it is like it's looking for these treatments that are considered the gold star for depression treatment. They're evidence-based. And so going back all the way to 2003, there was a RCT done in Uganda, and it found that it significantly reduced depression in program participants compared to a control group. And there was an absolute reduction of depression symptoms in 75% of the participants 6 months following the end of treatment. So pretty remarkable. Based off the results of these RCT, Columbia University, the same team of researchers that we're working with, has then rolled this out extensively across sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East. They've worked with USAID, they've worked with CARE, they've worked with UN refugees. The entire Ministry of Health in Lebanon is using this model. And so there is an extensive body of evidence, numerous RCTs that have demonstrated that this type of therapy really does work. So kind of like showing this is the manual that was created, some of the different studies that sort of demonstrate that. So I'm going to go into like a little bit about how it works. So what is actually the kind of the details of this specific therapy model? So first piece is training local community members. They're non-specialists. They don't have to have any previous experience in psychiatry or anything like that. And then what we do is we form support groups, the therapy groups of about 7 to 8 people, and they come together for a total of 8 sessions, an hour and a half each. The meetings happen in local neighborhoods and community centers and local churches, basically the spaces and places where people already are. And the therapy in itself, what it actually is based on helping people to understand the interplay between their depression and depression symptoms and their day-to-day life, and then how their day-to-day life affects their depression and depression symptoms. All along, we're trying to help people to learn the tools to better be able to manage their depression and form a supportive community around that, building out the stronger networks. So, like I mentioned before, you might think that like to get these kind of results, like I said, you might think it's a huge team of social workers and psychiatrists and everything behind it, but the really exciting part about this is that we are working with local community members. They are the people who are there helping to guide the conversations that are happening in the groups, and they are building that therapeutic community. Sometimes I kind of describe it as it's not something that would be unlike what a really good, emotionally intelligent, thoughtful friend would do. If you have that friend who's a really good listener who helps kind of ask you the thought-provoking questions and is willing to go a little bit in depth around like the specific situations. interpersonal therapy is very specifically focused on the here and now. And so it's not looking at some of like the longer periods of trauma that people face, but it's very practical. And so I think for that reason, it is possible for these lay community health workers, as people are often they're called, to be able to implement this therapy. It's very simplistic in the right sort of ways, because it's very easy to grasp and the techniques are very easy to grasp. And so I think there's a lot of promise, and that's very widely being implemented. The idea of community health workers being able to take on very specific narrow sets of tasks and doing that in concrete ways. Specifically, the training that we do, we'd give about 2 days of orientation and then 4 days very intensely of like actually the therapy model. And then during the pilot, we had a therapist, like an actual psychologist, sit in on all of the groups just to ensure the quality was there, and then had a weekly supervision. And so it was like somewhat hands-on in the initial training. And now as we've gone forward post-pilot, all of the facilitators are running their own groups completely independently, and we continue to have weekly supervision. So that's some of like the technical background of what that looks like. So just want to also just kind of go back to that moment around working with these community members as a therapist. There was a study that was published in the Annual Review of Clinical Psychology, which looked at 27 clinical trials, specifically of community-based health workers in low-income settings. And they concluded that they found strong effects in reducing the burden of common mental health disorders. So there really is a significant body of evidence that it is possible for community members to be able to do this. So kind of despite this body of evidence demonstrating this impact, this model, no one was doing this yet in Latin America. And so that's kind of where Vida Plena was born out of, really with the goal to be able to replicate these successes. So my background is I have a background in master's in social work, not as a therapist, but as a kind of program administrator. And I'd been working in Latin America for a number of years. I've been a number of years at this point, and I really became interested in the idea of livelihoods and trying to help people to have better jobs, and kind of thinking about that was the best way to have impact. And so I went to Ecuador to run a fair trade company, where I worked with women who made handmade jewelry, which meant lots of time sitting around kitchen tables, stringing beads, and hearing women's stories. And part of that, I met one of the women whose name, I'll call her Maria, and unfortunately her husband had died from suicide, leaving her with 4 children to take care of. And despite the fact that we had given her a job with like a steady income, had health benefits even, her family was struggling pretty significantly. And so I was working to try to connect her with some sort of a mental health services. But because of the distances, the logistics, just the challenges of like where we're based, I wasn't able to help her. And so it was when I learned about organizations such as the Friendship Bench and later on Strong Minds, and really had these innovative programs which were based on evidence and operating at scale, that I felt inspired to be able to then bring that to Latin America. And it just felt like this needs to happen here. We need to be able to offer this to people here as well. So kind of like where we're at with that is we created a pilot. So we launched last year, and we ran a pilot. I went through the charity entrepreneurship program, for those who are familiar, with my co-founder, Anita Caslin, who is a clinical psychologist, Ecuadorian. And we launched with a pilot, and we trained with Columbia University. We trained 16 people, and we ran 10 different groups. And so kind of like here's like our initial results from the pilot, and just to kind of quantify, this is just pre-post. We didn't have any sort of control group. And we are currently in the process of doing 3-month follow-ups to make sure that these are durable results. But the baseline is that we have positive indicators. Things are moving the direction that we want to see, and there was like a positive impact. In some ways, it wasn't surprising because, again, we're building off of this really strong evidence base. But I have to say, like personally, as an individual, there's still a part of me that was thrilled and shocked and a little bit nervous as we started to pull this together. Of like, I hope it's okay. I hope we did it right. And so, actually, like seeing that come together was really, really kind of exciting. just to be able to talk a little bit, this group, like what we are looking at in terms of our indicators. So the main thing we're looking at is depression changes. So we use the PHQ-9, the Patient Health Questionnaire 9, which is one of the most common evaluations for depression. We also look at the GAD-7 for anxiety, the PCL-5 for PTSD. As a nod thanks to Sam, we do look at subjective well-being and some also pieces like human flourishing scale. And so what we're doing, so in terms of like monitoring and evaluation, our goals is mainly to be able to see depression reduced and then be able to do that at scale. And so that's kind of like the key pieces we're looking at, and then a number of other secondary indicators kind of changing through that. A little bit about cost effectiveness. So with that, we did a initial, thanks, I also have to say really thank you to Sam, who really helped a lot. We did a predictive cost effectiveness analysis, and we believe that operating fully at scale will be able to offer treatment for $77 per person, and that would be about for $17 per well-be. Of course, to have like a little bit of context and what that means, that would bring us to about hopefully 8 times more cost effective than give directly and direct cash transfers in terms of subjective well-being specifically. So all of that to say, there were challenges. And so as practitioners, if we think about bringing mental health into other existing programs, I don't want to pretend that it's just going to be like perfect and easy and everything's going to go well. There's a couple specific things that we found during our experience with the pilot and continue to be challenges. The first is really high levels of suicidal ideation. While there is more growing openness for mental health and mental health care in Latin America, there's still like a threshold of people who are seeking out services, and that threshold does translate into people who are really suffering at a very bad, like a much worse point. And so because of that, I'd say about average 10% of the people that we're working with have pretty high levels of suicide ideation. And so initially when I conceptualized Vida Plena, the idea was we were going to screen those people out and refer them for other services. That kind of brings us to the second difficulty, which is it's difficult to find good places to be able to refer people for those services. When people need more intensive care, it's hard to find them. And so that's a reason why an organization like this exists, is because the public system is broken, and it's bureaucratic. There's not enough spaces, and there isn't the availability of care that we need when somebody needs to be able to get psychiatric care for their illness. And then the last kind of challenge I want to bring up is that therapy, psychotherapy, is not a panacea for every single problem that people are going to face. It's an important component, but it's not going to fix all of somebody's problems. So very specifically in our context, we work with people who are low-income Ecuadorians and then refugees who are coming from Colombia and Venezuela. And the reason people are leaving Colombia and Venezuela is very often related to the violence that is happening in those countries. And often people are fleeing. They're fleeing armed groups who are actively pursuing them. And so, like, we've had situations where, like, we're working with the facilitators and they're like, oh, this person, they're having panic attacks, and we need to, like, help them with their panic attacks. But then, like, you dig into a bit more, they're not having panic attacks. They're receiving credible death threats. And therapy is not, we're not going to therapize away these panic attacks. These are credible death threats to their door. And so those challenges still exist, and those challenges don't just go away by therapy. And then the context we're working in, it should be like United Nations is supposed to help people in those sort of like high conflict spaces. But again, they're overwhelmed. They're already overburdened. And so there's a lot of challenges as a program to know that how to help people when there's these outside pieces that are very clearly affecting their mental health. It's not the type of thing that just like goes away. So we're creating these programs. Creating a mental health program doesn't create these problems. Those problems already exist, but you will feel them more acutely once you added a mental health component to your program. So kind of calling those pieces out to attention. So just going to like talk about like kind of where we're going next as a program, a little bit like our vision for scaling. Really, over the next 2 years, it is our goal to be able to scale within Ecuador. We hope to be able to reach this year 1,500 people and then 6,000 people next year. But really within, and then be able to expanding kind of within the region. And so within 5 years, we hope to be really setting the bar within the region for what it looks like to provide evidence-based mental health at scale. The way we plan to be able to do that is using this model of community health workers. In Ecuador, we can train a community health worker for about $200, and then they are paid. They receive a local salary of $9,000 a year, which locally is quite a good salary. And for that, each one of those people can then reach about 400 people annually. So our goal by end of next year is to have at least 50 facilitators, and that allows us to be able to scale pretty quickly. But I kind of want to zoom out even further, just a little bit about where we're really kind of the big picture where we're hoping to be. So at that kind of cost of $77 per person, there's about 33 million people, roughly give or take, in Latin America that are currently living with depression. And so for a budget of $250 million a year, over the course of 10 years, we could potentially reach every single person in Latin America who has depression. Of course, that's a pretty big budget. I'm not saying that we personally would be the ones to do that. But if we look at going back to that statistic about where national governments are, under 1%, in Ecuador it's 0.4% of the public health budget is spent on mental health. If we are able to tweak that just a little bit, that is where we'll be able to actually reach this, because counterfactually, UNICEF released a report saying that $33 billion is lost annually to mental health. And so all of a sudden, comparatively, that $250 million is not that high and is actually an achievable number. And so that is really what we're hoping to do, is really be able to incorporate this as part of the national health programs and be able to demonstrate, hopefully with the help of researchers, that there is an absolute counterfactual benefit to including mental health into the programming that they're already offering. So just to kind of conclude, you can see that mental health is an essential part. We've talked about how mental health care is an essential component of both Christian and international development efforts. Mental health illness affects millions of people worldwide, and without effective mental health care, they face a lifetime of suffering and exclusion from society. So as Christians, we need to care for the whole person, and that does include their mental health. And then as the international development community, mental health needs to be integrated into a comprehensive model of global health and development that addresses both the most vulnerable communities and individuals. So using the Vida Plena model and other sorts of evidence-based pieces for mental health care in Latin America and other places is an example of how this can be both cost-effective and it can be scaled. So I just really like to call this prioritizing mental health as a fundamental human right for both on the level of individuals, organizations, and governments. We can work together to bring these services and integrate them. And really, what is our ultimate goal here? As we to create a more just and compassionate world where all individuals have the opportunity to live a full and flourishing life. So with that, I want to just show a little bit more of kind of the voices of somebody else who is this is one of the community facilitators who we're working with.
Con Vida Plena entendí que era parte de una sintomatología de la depresión, algo que me gustó muchísimo porque siento que mi divinidad me trató de la manera como me gusta, con conocimiento, porque el desconocimiento te hace un esclavo. Y cuando llegué a Vida Plena, pues mi querida yo y mi querida Anita me recibieron con una gran sonrisota y yo dije, bueno, creo que llegó a un lugar agradable.
Todos nos apoyamos con nuestra querida amiga Dime y le damos un gran abrazo.
Llegan las personas como con expectativas. A algunos les cuesta abrirse, a otras les gusta solamente ser oyentes. Pero en el camino de los grupos van desarrollando estas habilidades de comunicación por la observación. Las personas que no querían participar se sienten motivadas por otras. Y se va creando como esta empatía del escuchar e intervenir prudentemente ante una situación de una persona que está exponiendo. Soy una persona amable, poderosa, llena de muchas bendiciones. Y si el día de hoy no va bien, yo me voy a encargar de hacerlo mejor. Traspasa el momento del grupo y empiezan a apoyarse fuera de este momento. Entonces, hola, ¿cómo estás? Se llaman, se escriben, se invitan a tomar un café, a escucharse en otro momento, y creo que esa es una de las proyecciones, ¿no?, del programa, de que los lazos y los vínculos sean primero de reconocerte delante de una persona que también vive lo que tú estás viviendo, pero también que pueda significar el apoyo de esta persona, que no es una obligación, pero nace de cada una de las personas. Es bonito ese vínculo que se crea. No sabes cuánto era mi anhelo de poder tratar mi depresión, y es algo tan costoso, es algo inaccesible en mi vida. Y yo creo que no solamente en Latinoamérica tiene que darse, creo que hay muchas personas que necesitan en el mundo entero tener un programa que les acobije y que les apoye.
1, 2, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Listo, para adentro, vamos.
Vida Plena para mí es un proyecto que debería estar en todas las comunidades, así de sencillo. Quisiera decirle a Vida Plena y a todos los que somos parte de este proyecto que sigamos creyendo, que me siento en un lugar donde finalmente conseguí un propósito que es posible llevarse a cabo.
Bueno, hola, Ultimita. ¿Cómo está?
Me llevo un montón de esfuerzos, me llevo un montón de estrategias creadas para poder seguir adelante. Me llevo una noble tarea de seguir conectada a la vida, porque eso fue lo que me enseñaron. De ambos, pues súper agradecida, porque como dices, aprendí a que soy digna para recibir y que tengo la capacidad para dar. Eso fue mi vida plena.
Hola, ¿cómo está, profe? Disculpe. No, mi amor, te amo.
Hasta no me rescata. Sí, estoy muy orgullosa de ser de acá. A veces uno ve la parte económica, no, ay, no, esto de la migración, no, lo que te motiva. No, tengo que salir, hay otra oportunidad económica también. Sí, claro que sí. Y desde afuera se van y te dicen, no, tienes que salir porque allá no hay futuro, ta. Y uno dice, el futuro soy yo. Latinoamérica soy yo.
Thank you all. I guess I just really want to kind of leave you with that thought of like, what do we want the future to look like, and how can we incorporate that holistic view? And so, thank you so much.
In the interest of time, we'll take only 2 questions. Yes.
Have you communicated with any like policy makers in Latin America or Ecuador who are responsible for kind of public health budgets, and how maybe some of the evidence that you could generate with this could be useful to them?
Had like initial conversations with like at the municipal level, like so within the we started within the city of Quito, and so kind of like we've started to build in with some of those like more local institutions. But I think that would be like the next step. My hope is to be able to generate a convincing body of evidence to then be able to go to them and say like, look, we've been doing this, and then how do we can like really start to roll this out at a bigger scale? Yeah, that's like the next step.
Might be useful to speak with them beforehand, because maybe the type of evidence that would convince them.
That's true.
Will change like how you gather data as you're doing it. You know?
That's a really great thought. Yeah, it's kind of like incorporating them into that fuller conversation. Yeah, I really appreciate that
We want to
suggestion.
see this.
Yeah.
One last question.
The 9 question, what was it that you can use to evaluate?
PHQ9, yeah.
I'm not super familiar with that. Is it just from asking those 9 questions, hypothetically, like in a survey, you can like reliably determine whether or not someone is suffering from depression?
Yeah, the PHQ9, that scale, it's a self-evaluation, so it's not exactly like it's not a diagnostic tool. It's asking people about the symptoms in their daily lived experience with depression. And so a clinician would tell you technically it's not a diagnostic. That said, it's almost less important to me in that sense, like going back to subjective well-being. If a person's like suffering on a daily basis, they feel that they are living without hope. They feel that their day-to-day life, their relationships, their sleep, all of these pieces of their life are being dramatically affected. That's really what we care about. So it's like we don't force people. People don't have to have a diagnosis to participate in the groups, but it's more of that self-experience of like my life is at a point where I just feel like there are so many of these different elements. And so I think what that comes down to is really valuing somebody's own experience, their own evaluation of how they feel that their life and their circumstances are, and so respecting that particular piece. Yeah, well, thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate it.
I'll ask the last question.
So we're really
Yeah, so my last question is, I come from a low income setting where this method has been proven to work. But from my own experiences, like you've said, we spiritualize mental health care. And how are you dealing with stigma? Because from my own experience, in my own setting, if you go out and you seek mental health treatment, you're actually stigmatized. It's like it's chronic and people never believe that you get out of it. And it's kind of, you get a label on you. That's why people don't go out to seek for those services. So I'm wondering, in the case of Latin America, since there are similar contexts, how are you dealing with this?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'd say broadly around stigma, like at least I'll say I'm not sure exactly which country you're from.
Uganda.
Uganda. Oh, okay, yeah. So if we're talking about it there. So I would say broadly within Latin America, my experience in Ecuador, the pandemic, one of the few positive benefits was that it did open up a new conversation around mental health and breaking down some of the stigmas there and just bringing in new awareness. And so when we were recruiting people to be part of the pilot last fall, I, as part of this Y Combinator suggestion of doing things that don't scale, personally went around and handed out flyers and talked to people in the market. And I found it really remarkable because I was trying very intentionally to use language that was like not mental health clinical, so I was like, this is a group, these are people who are coming together who are having kind of like feeling really low, they're having a lot of problems, and they're feeling kind of down. And then people would be like, oh, like they're depressed. And I was like, yeah, that's correct. and then people are like, oh yeah, I need that, or like, oh, my neighbor needs that. And so just kind of, I was truly surprised. It was like a really interesting update of this, like how people already had a little bit of language around that. These are people, the fruit sellers. These aren't people who are necessarily in those spaces, but partially because of that. Now that doesn't say there's this awareness, and that is the next piece of like actually taking that step to attend a group or like to get the help. That is like the next step in that process. But I think there is a little bit more awareness that is growing. And so, but what it is then it's like that, breaking down that stigma. And I think something that it doesn't have to do a little bit. There's an interesting balance. I think what's happening right now with language is there's been a long trend toward trying to medicalize mental health, and I think that's valuable in the sense it does break down some of the stereotypes. But then I think there is also this piece of like but then it becomes it still feels like the problem is we have this thing, like you're saying, it's like icky, like if we're gonna catch it, like if somebody else has this problem and like I don't know, I could catch their disease or something. And I think what that really is just more comes around to this sense of we all go through really difficult moments, and sometimes a lot of our circumstances in life, it does bring you to a point. And I think we have this hope that if we like put it on the person, it's like their fault. Then it's like it won't happen to me. But I think what the reality is life circumstances are a huge part of what causes mental illness and depression specifically. And someone is like having that humility as Christians to accept that like there's a lot of different pieces to that. And so, yeah, there's lots of elements to it. But yeah, I think that's kind of a summary. So
Thank you.